In this art lesson, we're going to be making an artist response to the work of Sonia Delaunay. By the end of this lesson, you'll have produced something that looks similar to this. Do take your time with this art task. Feel free to just do a little bit each day and enjoy it. For today's lesson, you'll need two very simple pieces of equipment: a black Biro pen and an A4 piece of paper. Now, for making art, the thicker the paper, the better. However, any piece of A4 paper will do fine. The artist that we're going to be looking at in today's lesson is called Sonia Delaunay. Sonia Delaunay was born in Ukraine, but she did most of her painting in Paris. Delaunay is an abstract painter. Make a small box at the top right-hand side of your sheet and write some quick ideas about what abstract art means. I sometimes like to say that abstract art is simply having fun with colours, patterns and shapes. Sonia Delaunay certainly enjoys shapes, especially circles. Look at the way that Delaunay uses lots of different circles and lines that overlap each other, and then using loads of bright colours, she creates really interesting patterns across the surface of her paintings. Now, because not everybody has a lot of art equipment at home, we're going to see what we can do using just a black Biro pen. To get started making a response to the work of Delaunay, we need to start off with some sketches. Draw 4 rough boxes down the left-hand side of your piece of paper. We're going to create what's called thumbnail sketches. These are very quick and simple ideas that help us to get an idea for how we might compose a more finished piece. So, by looking at some examples of Delaunay's work online for inspiration, we can quickly start to create our own arrangements of shapes that can give us some ideas for what we might do for a more finished piece. So here I'm just literally creating some random shapes, random lines in these little boxes that we've drawn. And by doing different ones, 4 different ones, we can start to get an idea of what we like, what sort of arrangements of shapes we like. So this one is quite random. You've got some circles here and then some lines going out to the side. This one's a bit more symmetrical, so you've got something similar on the left to what's here on the right. And then I've got 2 more spaces. So I've got my 4 very rough thumbnail sketches there, and I especially like these bottom 2 because I started to really look at how Delaunay breaks up her circles with these lines going through the middle. Now what I'm going to do is thicken up some of the lines in these thumbnail sketches to make them a bit more clearer and a bit neater. And then what we need to look at is how we replace colour whilst we're just using a black Biro pen. Remember, when you're generating these kinds of ideas, don't stress it. You can't go wrong with abstract art. At first it's just about seeing what happens, playing around with different arrangements of shapes. Then afterwards you can start to make decisions about what you like, what you don't like, what's working, what's not working, and then we can make changes and adjustments and just get it towards being something that's more of a completed piece of abstract art. Just enjoy it. So what I've done with my 4 thumbnail sketches is I've made all the lines bolder so that these little ideas become neater and we can start to make decisions about which we prefer and which we might want to take further. I've also added a date and a title to this sheet. It's always important to put a date and a title on your work. Now, Because Sonia Delaunay uses lots of different colours in her paintings, but we're only using a black biro, we have to adapt and find ways of using the biro to make these pieces more interesting without the use of colour. In this other example over here that I did earlier, you can see how I've used different patterns to replace colour and fill the different shapes. In this lower example, you can see how I've used different patterns to fill the different shapes to get different textures from section to section. Whereas in this example, instead of patterns, I've simply used different levels of shading that you can use a biro pen to achieve. This is a stage with your ideas to be experimental. Try to see how many different ways you can use a biro pen. Now, if you do have access to some different art materials, then feel absolutely free to use them. In this top idea, I've got this small watercolour palette and I've mixed some different greens and blues and just filled each section with colour to get this almost stained glass window effect. And for this idea, I've used some different coloured felt pens. I've gone for some highly contrasting colours, much like the kinds of colours that Delaunay uses in her paintings. Next, draw yourself a bigger rectangle in the middle of your piece of paper. I drew this rectangle with a ruler because this is where we're going to make a more finished artist response. Now, if you have been using some other art materials, like in these examples, then feel free to continue using those on this bigger piece. However, I think I'm going to stick to doing a biro piece to demonstrate that even with very simple supplies, you can still make some good art. Out of these two biro ideas, I think that this one is the most closely related to the work of Sonia Delaunay, because of these straight lines that are cutting straight through the middle of circles. However, I also like some parts of this idea, especially this patchwork area on the left. So what I'm going to do in this bigger piece is combine different parts of both of these biro ideas. So I've started off by marking out the basic shapes and lines in my piece. It's like an enlarged version of this idea, except that you can see there's more lines in this area here, and that's to match the patchwork quality of this idea. So the next step will be to add patterns into lots of the different shapes. So, using my sketch as a guide, I've started to fill in some of the basic patterns in some of these shapes. For example, I've got the triangles, the circles with the outlines, the wavy lines, the square lines, the wavy lines with dots in between, some more circles, some more triangles, and these sort of holly leaf shapes with the dots in between. Before worrying about any of the blank shapes for now, I think I'm going to focus on finishing the pattern sections by shading in different areas on each of these patterns. So as you can see, I've started to use some techniques like shading and some linear shading to fill in some of these first patterns. Now, for shading with biro, it's all about practice and patience. I tend to start off quite bold at one edge and then start to press lighter and lighter with the pen so that it fades out. You can practice this kind of technique on a spare scrap of paper. Just practice making a bold edge with the pen and then gradually fade out. You can even sometimes, while the pen's still a little bit wet, use your finger to just make it blend that little bit more. What I'm going to do next is start to fill in some of these other shapes with linear shading. That's where you use a series of lines next to one another to fill the space. As you can see, I've gone ahead and filled a few different sections with linear shading. This is where you draw lots of lines very close together. It's a process that takes a bit of practice and quite a lot of patience, but definitely give it a go because it's very rewarding and quite relaxing. For the next step, I'm going to fill in lots of these remaining sections with different levels of Biro shading to create this kind of patchwork effect from this small idea. I am also going to leave one or two sections white, just so that there's some tonal contrast throughout this piece. So, I've just finished shading in all the remaining sections of this piece, leaving some sections white, such as this curve here, and this section here. Some sections I've shaded in solid black, such as here, 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 and little bits like there and these corners. And then other sections I've shaded in from each edge and then sort of faded out towards the middle of those sections to give this shadow effect. Same with sections like this, except that the light comes up to one edge, so you just shade 3 edges and then go in. And then in your final result, when all of these different areas of shading and different patterns all come together, you end up with something that can look really nice. Now, as you may be able to tell, the Biro pen is one of my favourite things to draw with, so I've had a lot of practice in making shadows look this smooth. So to be able to do things like get your shadows nice and smooth, and to draw your shapes nice and neat and things like that, it just takes a lot of practice and patience. So keep trying, keep doing creative pieces like this, and you will get better. Finally, with this piece of work, we need to do a little bit of writing. The first task that I want you to do is to look at the piece that you've produced, and writing in full sentences, I want you to describe what you've enjoyed about making this piece and what you find successful. Which areas in the piece do you like the most? For example, I really like where there's a really dark bit right next to a really light bit. I think that gives the piece a real contrast. And then, what would you change about the piece if you were to make another? Are there any areas that you don't really like that are less successful? For example, I think that this section over here could be perhaps neater or changed in some way. For these written tasks, you may run out of paper on this first sheet, so feel free to grab another piece of paper to do this writing on. Once you've written about the strengths and weaknesses of your own piece, I'd like you to research abstract art and write a small paragraph or two describing what it is, and can you find any other abstract artists that you like the work of? And for a final bonus task, I've been using the phrase tonal contrast throughout this video. Can you describe what tonal contrast means? And if you're not sure, Google tonal contrast and see if you can find out. Thank you for taking part in this art lesson, and please continue to be creative and make art during the lockdown.